Here in the UAE and globally, we have seen examples of where people have risen up to offer services during this pandemic. Today's speaker, we are delighted to have with us Dr. Ben Liu, who will talk to us about how volunteering can help to build the resilience we need to face not only the challenges, but build a resilient future. Dr. Benjamin Liu is an associate professor at the School of Social Work, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and faculty director of international service at the Center for Social Development in St. Louis. He works as a senior researcher for the United Nations Volunteer Program and co-leads the Tripartite Global Research Agenda on Volunteering for Peace and Development in partnership with the UNV program. He earned his Bachelor's of Science in Sociology in 2000 and his MSW in 2003 from Brigham Young University and his PhD in 2010 from Washington University in St. Louis. Dr. Ben Liu, we look forward to your presentation and the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Bridge, and I am thrilled to be here. I hope that you had a chance to listen in on the yesterday's webinar. Today we'll build off of that in some ways from a more global perspective. I'm looking forward to talking about some of the global risks around COVID-19, but also around other issues that certainly we experience, and I think that you see a lot of in the Mena region around issues of dislocation of people, of water, and other risks that you experience fairly frequently. All right, so although I'll be talking about the virus and the situation that's occurring across the world, just recognizing that many of the principles that I'll be talking about today are focused on community resilience across the board, whether that's dealing with any kind of shock or stress or disease that we experience. So I will start out the presentation by looking at a general discussion of the value of volunteering to resilient communities and also to resilient individuals. And then I'll be providing some case examples of the value of volunteering in past epidemics, specifically Ebola and cholera. You know, we've made a lot of progress since 2015 around Ebola, certainly, but I think it's clear that systems still aren't prepared to deal with the effects of SARS-CoV-2 as it's spreading throughout the world. So we'll be talking a little bit about that and examples of how we can learn from those past experiences. And then finally, we'll open it to a discussion of Q&A, as Bridge talked about, and we'll have some back and forth. So why volunteering for resilience? Why is volunteering important? Well, we know that during times of shock and stress that volunteering is accentuated. We see an uptick of people who are interested in helping out in their communities, but also we see that that isn't always sustained. So although there's an initial interest and a lot of participation, that interest quickly dies off if it's not sustained over time. So part of looking at what makes communities resilient and volunteering resilient is how we can support that volunteering in a way that allows it to sustain itself over time and to take advantage of the many great benefits and distinctive values of volunteering that we couldn't otherwise have if volunteering wasn't supported. Part of it is around what governments, NGOs, and others can be doing to support resilience. There's often a debate around the role of governments versus civil society in strengthening resilience and in managing risk. So part of what we'll be looking at as we look at volunteering is not just about what formal organizations can do in terms of supporting volunteers, but also what volunteers do informally. So a lot of you in the call today are probably with volunteer involving organizations. So that's part of what I'll be talking about. Part of it is also just people helping people in their communities and how we can support that kind of volunteering that enhances resilience across the board for people who are engaged in any kind of help work. As Bridge mentions, resilience is basically the ability to bounce back from hard times. So there's a lot of different definitions, but that's the essence of it. And that goes from individuals to communities to nations. So what we need to remember when we're thinking about resilience is that it's not just about community resilience, but a community is made up of individuals who are also affect the resilience of that community. So part of what volunteering does is it allows people to be to help in their own ways that can help reduce isolation and depression. It can increase mental health. And there's a lot of positive benefits of volunteering that then can scale up to a community level and eventually then to a national level. And so vulnerability is at the heart of that. And as we decrease people's vulnerability and increase their individual capacity, then we can help them be more resilient as communities and as nations. So I am a researcher, and so primarily I'll be talking about some research questions today. First of all, what qualities are associated with resilient communities? There's been a lot of research around what this means. How do we build resilient communities? So we'll start with some of the qualities that enable communities to be resilient. And then we'll be looking at the distinctive attributes of volunteers. And distinctive attributes is an important characteristics of what I want to talk about today, because we're assuming that volunteers bring something of value that can't necessarily be brought by governments, by NGOs, by other organizations. And so part of what we'll look at today is what's the distinctive value or attributes that the volunteers bring to this work? And finally, what are some of the key practice implications during this global pandemic for volunteering and for volunteer involving organizations? So to start out with, what qualities are associated with resilient communities? This is based on a literature review that we did for the State of the World's Volunteering Report, which was published last year. So I'll go through this pretty quickly, but if you want more information about that, I would encourage you to download the report to read it. It talks a lot about resilience and volunteering at the community level, and it was across 15 different countries. So I'll be drawing on a couple examples today from Sudan and from Egypt, from the Mena region. But there are other countries there that if you want to read the report, will give you a lot of good background information on that. So when we did a literature review, we found quite a few qualities that were associated with resilient communities across the board. And I'm going to be talking about 3 of those today. There are more than 3, but in terms of volunteering and its distinctive attributes, there is a strong association between resilient communities and the ability of volunteers to self-organize, to connect with other people. I'm going to talk about this issue of redundancy and diversification, which isn't often talked about, but I think certainly very important when we think about collaborations and partnerships with volunteers and voluntary organizations. And then finally about feedback and learning, and how volunteers, especially during times of crisis around global pandemics, can really contribute to a feedback and learning process that can help communities to be resilient. So to start out with, how do the distinctive attributes of volunteering help or hinder community resilience? Well, I had mentioned before the importance of focusing on the distinctive attributes. And this is based on theories of complementarity. And these theories basically get into this debate of the role of civil society versus governments and others in managing risks. And the idea is that everyone brings different qualities to this picture. So it's not necessarily civil society or governments, but it's actually all of these people working in partnership together. And so volunteers produce certain kinds of public or collective goods that can't be produced by voluntary organizations, that can't be produced by governments. And understanding that and recognizing that, and then supporting those distinctive attributes and qualities of volunteers is really one of the best ways to take advantage of volunteers' capacities, and to also support them with other organizations that have complementary capacities. So one of the first ones I want to talk about is self-organizing. What this basically means is that volunteers, especially those that are not affiliated with organizations, that are independent in communities and working with other people, when a disaster strikes, or when there is some kind of a strong shock or a stress to the system, then often volunteers come together voluntarily to solve a problem and to help. And some of the different I guess, adjectives that are used to describe these volunteers' efforts are speed and immediacy. We see that they are often the front line, the first ones to respond during crisis. Because volunteers are ubiquitous, they're everywhere. They can mobilize in very large numbers during a crisis, and they can do this in a self-organized way that doesn't take a larger coordinating body. There are some advantages and disadvantages to this, which we'll talk about later. But often another thing that is in some ways unfortunate, but a real distinctive quality of volunteers is they are often the only source available during crises, especially in rural areas, in poor areas where there's not a lot of organizations that necessarily get together. Volunteers are the only ones that can provide that first level of, or first line of response. Volunteers, because they sit outside of organizations, sometimes can be more flexible. They're not hemmed in by these strong or rigid standards. And in that way, they can innovate, they can be more flexible and help to solve problems in ways that organizations may not necessarily think of initially. And then most of us have probably experienced the ownership that comes with volunteering, that when you own that problem and you take it on yourself, that there's a strong sense of ownership for the solution. And so that's another way that volunteers and engaging volunteers in projects can really help to make the solution viable and sustainable, is because it's owned by the volunteers themselves through a self-organizing process. Just to give you an example of a quote that I think I took this one from an article where the writer was applying lessons from the Ebola crisis to African villages that were affected by coronavirus. This was in Liberia, but one of the points that the article was making was that the president appearing on TV or radio is not going to reach all the people. So that's only reaching a limited number of people who have access. And so they have volunteers going door to door to spread information about the virus, about the importance of quarantine, and convincing people of that. In this article was also talking about the Catholic Relief Services, which started a project in Senegal that initially started with the Ebola crisis, but now is scaled up. And so now they have surveillance groups of about 90,000 people. They're retraining them to spread news about the coronavirus. Another example that we took from the State of the World's Volunteering Report, and this again drew from a number of countries, but one of the ideas that was brought up was that in Sudan, this call to mobilize, or nafir, relies on a collective engagement. And that through this self-organization that groups can quickly mobilize. And in this case, it was to combat initiatives, reconstruct mosques, other things that were destroyed during conflicts. And this is an example just of how the self-organizing capacity of volunteers, even independent of organizations, can help to make communities more resilient over time. But as with the benefits of self-organization, there's also quite a few disadvantages that can make communities less resilient. And one of them is the question of public good. So of course, when we're relying on people's voluntary actions, we don't necessarily define what public good is. That is often people's own definitions. So for example, in what conditions might social activism and mobilizations hinder resilience? Obviously they can help enhance it, but definitions of public good, when they're relying on the bottom-up civil society, are not always beneficial. The idea of coordination is one that, again, as people spontaneously organize themselves to come together during disasters, there's many examples of where spontaneous volunteers were not needed during a crisis and actually just got in the way. Part of this is that they may not have the skills or their capacities, or they may not be trained in the way that they're needed. And so there's an issue also around amateurism, assumptions that volunteers are qualified or capable. Often they are, but often they are also not. And so issues around amateurism is also one of the challenges of using volunteers and relying on their self-organized responses to shocks and stresses. The other principle I want to talk about, and the second one, is learning and feedback. And what this essentially means is that in robust systems, in resilient systems, there are mechanisms that allow the systems to learn. There are feedback mechanisms or feedback patterns where information flows through the network and people can learn from the challenges that have come up. Again, looking at the widespread nature of volunteers, there's a wide geographic dispersion, and that allows people to gather knowledge in the smallest corners of communities. So often if there's partnerships with intergovernmental organizations, non-governmental organizations who need information from communities for cultural competence reasons, but also just to understand if an intervention is going to work, then volunteers can actually gather knowledge from people that would otherwise not have access. They can also diffuse knowledge. So one of the examples I showed below is how people are going knocking on door to door, spreading information about the coronavirus. This is something that volunteers can do to help spread this new knowledge across the globe, and again, in very small corners that would otherwise not be reached. So partially the reason that volunteers are important for resilience is because resilience is a counterweight to vulnerability. And that means that some people are benefiting more than others often. And so if volunteers can reach those who are most vulnerable in the most vulnerable corners of the globe, then that will increase the resilience of communities throughout the globe. And then finally, the contextual knowledge that volunteers bring, again, because they are local often, they know the situation on the ground, and they can bring that knowledge back to organizations and governments who may sit at a different space, often in capital cities or in larger regions where they don't have access to a lot of the contextual and cultural knowledge of more rural and isolated places. An example I wanted to draw from here was taken from IFRC, the International Federation of the Red Cross. And this was a public-private partnership that was established between IFRC and the Center for Disease Control, again, with the Ebola epidemic, but this time in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It relied on what is often referred to as citizen science. So it's people going around and gathering information from, again, very often isolated areas. In this case, they had organized over 800 volunteers who were able to gather real-time data and community perceptions, and then were able to incorporate those beliefs and misinformation and questions all into different interventions that they were building to combat the challenge of disease. Another example from Sudan, this was again taken from the State of the World's Volunteering Report. This was looking at individual volunteers within communities assessing water levels, and they were able to provide information that informed challenges about the water resources and the lack of water in these communities. But they also were able to advocate for local services because they were locals. They were affected by this problem. As they came together, they were able to advocate well for the problems that they shared as a community. And in that way, we're able to have a more holistic and cooperative approach to resource management. Again, there are challenges with learning and feedback. So when we rely on volunteers, we do see that in practice, knowledge tends to flow from more powerful actors to less powerful actors. And so even if volunteers and citizens have information to give back, often this isn't actually accepted or taken into consideration because there are power issues that prevent that from happening. And so often we see that the local knowledge that the volunteers bring is discounted. Sometimes this is because they lack affiliation with formal organizations. Sometimes it's because they're seen as amateurs. All of that does come into play. And then finally, there are some concerns about their limited expertise, again, around amateurism, concerns about low quality of data, that if they are gathering data at a local level, if it's not scientific or it's not coordinated in some way, then people do express concerns about it being low quality. I will say that they've done quite a bit of research in the area of citizen science around volunteers gathering data and have found that it's actually quite high quality. So even though there is an expertise around this, or there's a perception around limited expertise, that in research circles, the data actually tends to be quite high and quite reliable. And then the third principle and final principle I wanted to talk about in terms of community resilience is this idea of redundancy and diversification. What this basically means, it harkens back to this idea of complementarity that I had already talked about. But again, in resilient systems, we have different types of stakeholders and actors acting at different levels. And the reason this is important for resilience and bouncing back is because if one stakeholder gets taken out or is dysfunctional, then the others can come in and sort of fill that gap. In terms of diversity, also, if there's synergistic partnerships, so volunteers are bringing the value that they have around speed and availability and connection and all of those things with the resources that organizations bring, with the expertise that governments bring, and all of those systems working together is going to maximize the resilience of that system. So redundancy is really important, as well as diversification within a system, and volunteers provide important complementary value that is unfortunately often overlooked. It's often discounted. They're often seen as merely filling gaps or as cheap labor. But that is a real disservice to volunteering, because they do have all these other complementary values that, that if organizations and governments recognized and valued, would make systems much more resilient. They are a cost reductive measure, but they're not merely cost reductive. So I think if volunteers are seen as merely being, again, cheap resources or a cost saving measure, then they're really not taking advantage of the full value that volunteering offers to systems. Also, we see that volunteering, when it's left on its own, is not often sustainable, because we're relying on people's goodwill. And if there's not resources to support the volunteers in their efforts, then ultimately the volunteers will stop being able to provide those services without the complementary support and value. One example here is taken from the social mobilization lessons from Ebola in Liberia again. And this one looks at a partnership that brought volunteers to provide primary care and then providing more severe cases in clinics. And so it basically says that, you know, in a lot of countries, the primary care is provided by community health workers, trained volunteers who are able to provide the basic services, followed by level 2 and 3 and other sort of higher level clinical support that's needed in cases where there's a life and death situation. The challenges on the redundancy side, on the diversification side, again, limited capacity and safety concerns for volunteers. Without external support, volunteering is not necessarily sustained. Also, there's safety issues that when people self-organize and go out by themselves, they don't always necessarily take care of their own safety or have measures to do that. So they need safety equipment, for example, in order to be most effective. And even though they're willing to go out there and organize, if they don't have equipment, then that will limit their ability to be safe. There are some concerns about volunteering being treated, again, as a replacement for government services. So when we look again at the roles of the state, of governments versus civil society, some people do express concern that as volunteers get engaged, that will make governments take a step back. There are examples of that happening, certainly. And that's why it's important to stress that neither acting on their own, either governments or civil society or volunteers, are effective. It's really about a partnership and complementary action as they work together. In some cases, there is concerns, if we think about the ownership and the importance of ownership for volunteers, that when external agencies come in, this could weaken participation, it could weaken ownership at the local level. Also many examples of this happening. So the key takeaway here, I think, is that there needs to be a balance between engaging volunteers, recognizing the importance of their ownership, and also bringing in external organizations to support their efforts. So this one was taken, this quote from the State of the World's Volunteering Report. Again, this was about a female volunteer and her need for safety measures. She said that she would like to volunteer, but that she required support from organizations that would support her participation, because the places that she was going into, in this case, refugee camps, were in remote places. She felt that as a female and a parent that they posed a danger that with unreliable organization that she couldn't participate. And this is something that we hear often with volunteers who want to engage, but when left on their own, decide not to. This one was taken from a focus group participant in Egypt. That again, you'll find in the report if you go to that. So what are some of the main concerns that we talked about today about relying on voluntary action in times of crisis? Number one, can we expect citizens to voluntarily take on responsibility for managing risks? Is this something that we should expect from them? Number two, can we further strain the already stretched time and resources of people who are affected and vulnerable? Although we realize that people can volunteer, sometimes we need to really consider like how much we can ask of them during times of crisis. Around exclusion, issues of inclusion and exclusion, who benefits the most? When we are relying on people's goodwill, people do tend to exclude those who are outside of their circles. So without standards and protocol that require people to include others, we do see a lot of exclusion happening with self-organized volunteering and volunteering action generally. Issues of safety, issues of quality, are volunteers qualified to help? And then finally, the issue that we talked about around abdication of responsibility. Will volunteer groups, if they're acting as members of civil society to solve a problem, will they actually be supported with needed resources during a crisis? On the other hand, what we do see is if we don't engage volunteer groups, there are historical challenges with centralized systems, with governments that are coming in with mandates to control an issue. I know certainly here we see a lot of people who are pushing back against the self-isolation measures that are coming from the top, and part of that is again poor public understanding of what's in the best interest of citizens. Some people see government actions as culturally insensitive, or some governments or have poor political will to actually implement policies. So again, the reason I'm talking about this again is emphasizing the importance of complementary action, that we can't rely just on one or the other. And often when I hear debates about managing risk in situations, it's about government or civil society, it's about volunteers or organizations, and really that's an unrealistic argument. It's about the complementary action that we bring together through external actors and local volunteers that take advantage of the capacities and qualities of each type of stakeholder and each type of actor, and bringing them together in ways that can strengthen and support each other. So what implications do these have for practice during the current pandemic? I think one that is clear is when we talk about volunteering being self-organized. Yes, that's true, but we can't assume that leadership will emerge every time when there's a disaster or when there's a problem. So part of what organizations can offer is to help to manage the, volunteers, to organize volunteers in times of stress or shock. Issues of inequality, which we talked about, as having clear organizational protocol and standards that will minimize the chance that volunteers will exclude others, I think is important. And there's different resources around this that organizations, volunteer involving organizations can tap into. One that I've talked a lot about, but just want to hit again, is the allocation of resources must match the value add that volunteers can bring in partnership with community-based organizations. One thing that we see is that volunteers are often doing a large share of the work, often the lion's share of the work, but they're actually getting very few of the resources to support their efforts. And part of this is based on philosophy of volunteering, that we assume that people are just volunteering out of the goodwill of their hearts. And while this is true, it's not an efficient allocation of resources, because again, looking back at the complementarity, what it's doing is undermining all of the value that could be achieved from volunteers, and putting most of that effort and most of that money and resources at the organizational level. And that's not always the effective allocation of resources. So investing in local is very important for community resilience. Communities are comprised of individuals. Voluntary action is a fundamental component of community action. So although volunteers in this quote says they have comparative advantages to reach these last mile communities, thinking about, again, their ability to reach the very poorest and most isolated people, often their value remains underutilized and undervalued, and I would say also unsupported, despite the fact that ordinary citizens are really the core and the heart of resilient communities. So we really need to engage meaningfully with civil society. We need to create space for civil participation and citizen participation. And as we do that, people will engage, and we will get more value out of the many contributions unique contributions that they bring to the table. From the learning side, there are quite a few platforms out there that take advantage and allow community-based volunteers to collect and share information and learning. There's a lot of innovative technologies that, if those are taken advantage of, can help strengthen communities. And states also must help create mechanisms to hear the legitimate aspirations and concerns of their citizens, of volunteers. Again, with volunteers, we see that often information doesn't flow upwards because they are less powerful, and so they don't often get their voices heard. When in fact, if their voices were heard, then much better solutions, much more innovative solutions would ultimately come out of it. That doesn't mean that states have to listen necessarily all the time to what's said, but they should, or have to implement what's said, but certainly listening and learning is an important part of the process. And then finally, preparing. So we noticed with the examples that I had given you about the cholera outbreak in 2012, and then later Ebola in 2014, 2016, having trained volunteers that were able to respond was really important to having a capacity now to really quickly mobilize volunteers in response to the coronavirus. Many of the people who are currently involved were active and engaged 5 years before the cholera outbreak. And we see the same thing with the coronavirus. The volunteers that are helping are ones that were mobilized during cholera, during Ebola. These systems are in place well before it's needed. And so if we actually wait to start developing these systems when there's a problem, then surge activities won't be used or won't be useful. So those are some implications I had. I'm hoping that you also have some implications, some questions, thinking about how these distinctive attributes of volunteering reflect the resilience of your own communities during this pandemic or otherwise, and anything that they have for your current reality. So thank you, and I certainly welcome any questions that you have for me.
Thank you very much, Ben. That was very informative, and I believe you really have brought forth a new understanding of resilience to us. We heard from you about the World Volunteering Report in 2018. Definitely we'll take a look at it. We heard from you about volunteers self-organizing. We heard from you about investing in local volunteering. We heard from you about government, civil society partnerships, innovative technologies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Definitely, we know you have done a lot of very deep research. And at this stage, we know you're not a practitioner, but we do have some questions for you. So we're not going to let you go.
Great.
What are your thoughts on, given the quarantine measures that are in place, do you think digital volunteering can have the same effect in building resilience? Do you have any thoughts on how we can build for this when designing digital volunteering?
Yeah, I think that's certainly an important question right now with the global pandemic. And well, I would say that the digital volunteering probably doesn't have the same effect just because the nature of community is different in online and digital settings. I wouldn't say it has a less of an impact. So if we think about the principles of resilience around connection, certainly there are networks, online networks where volunteers can engage in that way. Connections are really important for resilience across the board. Again, the nature of community in that sense is very different. But if we think about a global community or a national community or whatever network level that the volunteers are able to engage in, that connection is very important. I do think one of the differences is around proximity. So we know that when people are helping people, that the nature of having someone close does motivate people to engage in a different way. in digital spaces, anonymity is something that can have both benefits and drawbacks. One of the benefits is that people can engage anonymously. So these, I guess, identity markers around gender or ethnicity or religion that sometimes prevent people from volunteering face to face, they can almost be anybody who they want to be online. And so engaging in that way, in some ways, can bring more people out who wouldn't normally volunteer. A second thing I'll just bring up really quickly is that it also allows for volunteering in much quicker and shorter stints of time. So issues around micro volunteering have been something that we've seen happening across the globe. Contact tracing is something that people volunteer to do that doesn't require long lengths of time. And so digital volunteering, because it is sort of something somebody can log on to a computer or a laptop or a smartphone, and really in micro stints help in some way. And so we do see that happening as well.
Thank you very much, Ben. We have several questions coming up as to where are the opportunities and how can I get it, and definitely we have answered those. Please go to www.volunteers.ae or go to www.sanit.ae or www.thekathav.e, and you will see various opportunities, both virtual opportunities and on the ground opportunities, and with different organizations. So that's the good news out there. Coming back to you, Ben, again. Some more questions that have been coming up. We have Khalid Taneji who's come up with a question. What are some of the challenges facing volunteers to be more resilient?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if we think about, I guess in that question, I've talked about community resilience. I haven't talked as much about individual resilience. And so I think if we're thinking about the resilience of volunteers, that's often about individual resilience. And certainly one of the things that stops people from volunteering is safety issues. I think I put up that quote around the woman who was not willing to volunteer because of that. So in terms of personal resilience, things that are really important again are having things in place to make sure that they feel safe and secure, that they can volunteer and not feel like if something happens that they won't be able to get out of it. Certainly around mental health is a big issue. So I would say in terms of, again, the principles of resilience around social support, self-connection, social cohesion, to the degree that we can support volunteers socially and in sort of meeting their basic needs, then they're going to be able to be more resilient and help during crises.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We have a message from colleagues from Jordan, and they say we work with a volunteering platform called Nano, and you can check it at www.nano.org. That's a NAHNO. And currently we are sharing online opportunities during COVID-19. So that's great. Things are happening around the region and we can all learn from each other. We have a question from Nazir. He says, do you think looking at volunteering as low-cost options could create problems in itself?
Yes, absolutely. If we only think about volunteering as a low-cost option, it can create a lot of problems, and I think we see that across the globe. I mean, to be honest, like volunteering is a low-cost option. We can save a lot of money and resources by relying on volunteers. But if we see it that way, then we often don't invest in the resources needed to prepare volunteers to support them long term. So in the short term, certainly volunteers are some ways that organizations use to cut costs. But if they don't actually invest long term in volunteers' capacity building, in their support, then again, they're not taking advantage of really the value of volunteers in their organizations. But it's not an uncommon thing to think of volunteers as merely a low-cost resource or as a cost-saving measure. But that is definitely a flawed view if that's how they're seen.
Sure. Thank you very much, Ben. Another question says, I believe when resilience is properly integrated in providing voluntary actions, it helps in boosting morale of volunteers and empowers them to own the intervention. Mm-hmm. How can the resilience of such groups be supported? And greetings from Nigeria.
All right, so greetings, Nigeria. Yeah, an important question. I think I was happy to see that in the UEA, I think there was a UEA volunteers platform that was recently launched, right? So that's, I think, one example of many that countries um, can initiate. So platforms where volunteers can get engaged in a process where they feel like they're connected to a bigger system, they will get that support, they will get that safety. Um, Often, again, we have the idea that volunteering is self-organized, and it can be and should be self-organized. And we don't want to squash that by coming in too heavy-handed from the top. But it's really about that balance of recognizing that ownership is really important, that as volunteers engage in self-organized way, that they're going to really own that solution. We want that. And we don't want to squash that by coming in from the top. But if we only leave volunteers to themselves, then they're going to struggle, they're going to fail. Long term, there's not going to be that sustainability. And so having systems in place, often from the state level, but also from NGOs, from nonprofits who value volunteering and understand the importance of volunteering, can really help in that process.
Excellent. I think we're really getting a lot of valued knowledge from you. I have another question. In terms of building sustainable resilience, do you think having online courses to prepare volunteers with knowledge and skills is needed prior to volunteering?
Again, a great question. I don't know that necessarily has to be online, but certainly at this time, that's one way we could take advantage of the digital space by creating online classes that support volunteers. There are quite a few out there, and I could maybe send through some links if you all would need them later, around free courses that are currently being offered to support volunteers, to prepare volunteers during disasters, but also to support community-based organizations. To think about how they can work with their staff, how they can work with their volunteers, so that they don't fail. Because a lot of resilience around volunteering is also resilience around volunteering organizations. And so one of the concerns that a lot of nonprofits and social organizations and volunteer involving organizations have in this time is issues of sustainability themselves. And so in terms of resilience of organizations, there are some good resources out there to help support voluntary organizations in this time. So they can also be resilient.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And for any who do want to find out more about Professor Ben Liu, they can definitely go to Google and type in Dr. Ben Liu, and they will see the enormous amount of research on volunteering and resilience. So there's a wealth of knowledge out there, very many practical examples and links to many more things. And obviously Ben has suggested that he'll be sharing more information that we will be coming back to you with. I have a question from Noor, who says, do you think that volunteering will open up more career opportunities in the future?
Yeah, this was, I think, a big one for the MENA region generally. I mean, I think, again, at the level of individual resilience, part of resilience is having employment, right? And this doesn't relate so much to the coronavirus, but I think certainly important when we think about the value of volunteering. I know, especially in the African region, there's a high youth unemployment rate. There's a lot of opportunities for skill building in this area. And one of the things that we've seen is, yes, volunteering is a great way to enhance employability. One of the challenges, though, is they can be also exploitative. So if it's used across the board as a youth volunteering scheme where, again, it's seen as low-cost labor or even free labor, and that has been a problem in some countries and in some situations. But certainly, if volunteering is supported, if skills are built and built into the learning platform for volunteers engaging in some kind of employable area, then that can be a real bonus for volunteering, and certainly a good direction for policymakers to consider.
Thank you, Ben. A question that has recurred a couple of times is regarding what can we as leaders do to advocate for volunteering as a tool to build resilience?
Yeah, and I don't know too much about how advocacy works in the MENA region generally. I mean, I know how it works here, and certainly civil society is really robust here, and I think that allows for a lot of advocacy at the ground level. I think being sensitive to mass mobilization, the mobilization of people in civil society in your region is important. I think sometimes it can undermine volunteering if it's done too heavy-handedly or not sensitively. But certainly as leaders of volunteer organizations, I think the advocacy is really an important part of your work, beyond service delivery, beyond just meeting the needs of your or clients or people in your community. If you're not advocating for volunteering and civil society generally as a space to engage, then I think you could be doing more in that area. But I'm also, again, coming from a region that values that a lot. So I think the important part of that question was around leaders and leadership. And so I think if there is some leadership around that area, around advocacy, then to any degree that you could do it is probably going to help with voluntary action.
Thank you very much. There's a question towards younger people, that many younger people are volunteering across various organizations instead of sticking with one organization over time. Do you see the same effect with building resilience?
Yeah, so one of the important parts of resilience, and again, an attribute of volunteering, is trust. People like volunteers and they trust volunteers because of the sort of pro-social nature, the altruistic nature of it. And one of the things that we see, again, linked with volunteering is trust, and long-term engagement with organizations does build that trust. That said, in a lot of our research, we've noticed that it's not just people volunteering long-term with an organization that builds trust. It can be episodic volunteering over time. So the important point about that is what some economists call the shadow of the future. So that as you're volunteering in an organization or with a certain group, that they see you as continuing that effort over time. It can be episodic. It doesn't have to be sustained at one point, but there has to be a vision of the future or a shadow of the future that will help to build that trust. Again, in the digital space, a lot of it could just be episodic help that comes here and there. And that's not of no value, but certainly to the degree that you can build trust and maintain that relationship, it's going to be of higher value with organizations.
Thank you very much. Last week in the United Arab Emirates, the Higher National Committee for Regulating Volunteering During Crisis was announced. This national campaign aims to support volunteering efforts at the national level and harness the expertise, skills, and talents of community members and involve them in the volunteering process. This campaign really has allowed everyone who makes up UAE society, nationals and residents alike, to volunteer and support teams working on the ground who are helping mitigate the repercussions of the coronavirus pandemic. We definitely see value in having a national platform, and the existence of the volunteers.ae platform, where all opportunities by the authorities are being posted for any member of the society to access is very valuable. Again, I have mentioned it earlier, but www.volunteers.ae. You can also call 800-VOL-AE, that is 800-865-23, or you can email info@volunteers.ae for any inquiries to browse the volunteers' various opportunities. Dr. Ben, we're coming to the end of our session, and I have one last question that I can take up, and it's from the floor. Thoughts on organizations like Enactus that encourage student groups to empower local opportunities? Do you think that helps prepare individuals to understand things better at ground level and also develop more passion in volunteering?
Yeah, I mean, Enactus is a great group, and I think to any degree that people can get involved in learning those skills, it doesn't have to be necessarily even volunteering. It can be some kind of an internship or a student organization, or lots of opportunities for young people to get engaged in different ways and learn these skills. But volunteering is certainly one of them, and I am excited and happy to see that the volunteering infrastructure across many countries is increasing. We've done also quite a bit of research with UNV around volunteering infrastructures, and the ability to support fraternal organizations, student organizations, clubs that are focused on volunteering and engagement with communities. All of it's going to help, I think, with employment, employability, people feeling like they have a role in society, even if they're young and not highly skilled yet. these are all opportunities to then develop those skills and to get them engaged in different ways. And so I think any type of program that can support that effort is going to help.
Thank you, Ben. I think before I go to the closing session, I would like to give you a few minutes to do any closing thoughts on this topic.
Okay, great. I'll just kind of reiterate what I said, and I think one of the main points that I hope that you hear from today's presentation is that volunteers bring a lot of value that could not be provided by governments, by organizations, by themselves, right? So one of the real kind of messages of the State of the World's Volunteering Report is trying to articulate this value. In business, they call this the unique selling proposition. They often call it the comparative advantage in economics. A lot of terms for this, but basically saying that volunteers do bring something that is unique. And that if they're valued beyond, again, their role as a cheap resource, then they will be supported. And so part of, I think, as leaders, as organizations that work with volunteers, part of your role is really advocate for that, to really articulate the value of volunteering, to acknowledge it yourself and to support volunteers with resources. And all of this can really help not only to provide more equity around volunteering, but really to be more, I'd say, more effective. Because to the degree that those partnerships with volunteers is really supported, that's when we're going to have the most resilient systems. So that's just the main message I want, I guess, to push home, and I hope that's heard.
Yeah,
that's it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And we do understand we woke you up very early this morning, but we really thank you for that. We learned more about building resilience through volunteering. We heard of the value of volunteering to resilient communities. We learned of case examples of the value of volunteering in past epidemics. We learned of some innovative technologies that contribute to resilience and volunteering. And we connected, Ben, through your valued input on a very important subject, and will continue such discussions virtually. Really, we are very thankful. The Emirates Foundation and IAVE, thank you, and thank all the participants for joining us and sharing your valuable insights and feedback. We thank you, Professor Ben Lowe, for sharing with us your insights into volunteering and resilience. And definitely, we will be sharing a feedback survey with all the participants, and would really look forward to hearing from you on how this session went and how we can do other sessions of value, not only during the COVID crisis, but beyond. We wish you all to be safe and help others to be safe. Thank you from the Emirates Foundation and IAVE. Thank you, Professor Ben Lowe.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions, and thank you, the attendees, for your questions as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Have a good day.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.